Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to a very special Automotive News live stream. We are celebrating our centennial anniversary, 100 years of automotive news. I'm Hannah Lutz, Director of Technology and Innovation Coverage, and I've had the honor of being part of the Automotive News team for 11 of its 100 years. Kellen Walker joins me as co-host today. Hi, Kel.
Hey, Hannah. As Hannah said, my name's Kellen Walker. I am the host of the Daily Drive podcast, and we have a great show planned for you today. We have dozens of our colleagues who will join us live to talk about the biggest stories in history and what's in store in the future.
That's right. And as part of our centennial celebration, we've been covering the history of the auto industry with an eye toward the future. We've also given out centennial awards to industry icons, including Roger Penske, Akio Toyota, Bill Ford, Mary Barra, Yusen Chung, and others. And we're preparing to publish a limited edition coffee table book at the end of the year. The book will feature historic milestones and fresh reflections on the forces reshaping the business. So to learn more and pre-order, visit autonews.com/shop.
All right, so to get started, we have two reporters who have delved deep into the ins and outs of the manufacturing world. Michael Martinez, who covers Ford and the UAW, and Larry Vellequette, who covers Toyota and Subaru. Mike, how you doing?
Hey guys, doing great.
There
Thanks
he
for
is.
having me.
There he is. And of course, my man, Larry Velquette, aka I know him as Larry Legend. Larry, how are you doing?
How you doing, Kel? Hi, Hannah.
Doing-
Hi, Mike.
Hello.
All right. So, Larry, let's get started with you. What are three things that have changed the most in the auto industry?
So I think let's talk about three things that changed it, right? That really transformed the auto industry. And in my lifetime, the big one, the monster one, was the bankruptcies of General Motors and Chrysler in 2008 and 2009. It transformed the industry for a whole number of reasons. The automakers were able to shed a lot of liabilities, bad bad juju on their books, right? That they were able to get rid of. But for the communities that grew up depending on those auto industries, it was a rough time. It was a very rough time in Detroit, down in my native Toledo. It was. I once described it as a neutron bomb going off. Right, all the buildings were still there, but the people were gone because of all the knock-on effects. People didn't go to restaurants. People didn't. They didn't know what was going to happen, and it really felt like the early days of the Great Depression, which also happened, over our 100 years. But that was one, and I'm gonna let Mike talk about another one.
Yeah, Larry, I'm going to take maybe an even bigger picture view here and say unionization, the rise of the UAW and organized labor. And coincidentally, we're celebrating our 100th anniversary today. The UAW celebrated its 90th anniversary yesterday. So we're pretty close in that regard. I'll have a centennial story about the impact of the UAW running in Monday's paper, fittingly on Labor Day. But essentially, the UAW has impacted the industry for decades in terms of its commitment to raising the standard of living for auto workers. You think about basic luxuries we enjoy today, weekends off, paid vacation, healthcare to some degree. That was all largely because of the UAW, because of unions. They had to fight for that, oftentimes quite literally. Those early days of the UAW, both before and immediately after it was founded, you had the Ford Hunger March in 1932, where workers marched to the Rouge demanding more protections, and 5 folks were killed. You had the Flint sit down strike in 36. You had the Autolite strike in Toledo in those early days as well. And the union, like I said, quite literally had to fight for many of the things auto workers and the rest of us in other industries enjoy today. Now, obviously, there's been a whole host of interesting developments within the UAW over the years. We've covered the corruption scandal that started back in 2017 or was uncovered in 2017. You've had legendary presidents like Walter Reuther, and obviously more recently, the 2023 strikes under President Sean Fain. So it's definitely changed the industry. Most would say for the better, but it's definitely had an impact.
You know, what's interesting, Mike. We just mentioned the 2023 strike and the 2023 contracts, right? And that leads us to our number three big change here, which is the rise of import automakers in the U.S. Directly, let's go back to that 2023. If you remember, in the fall of 2023, after that strike settled, one of the first byproducts of that strike was this very sudden surge in wages throughout automakers that were not unionized, because they were so afraid that they were going to lose workers to the union rates. And that really, that's been the trend forever, right? The reason that other workers in the industry got raises was because the UAW won them first. And then out of either a fear of being organized or just a fear of having to retrain workers, they went back and at least got closer to those rates.
Yeah, it
But
shows what that level of power that the workers have, that the UAW has.
yeah, and that's an indirect power, right? If you can affect the industry without actually working at those automakers, that's pretty powerful.
Mhm.
But let's talk for a minute about the rise of those import automakers, because it's really, really hard to underestimate what a change that is. I mean, shoppers today, we go by a Hyundai, we go by a Honda, a Toyota. Our forebears 50, 60, 70 years ago, that really wasn't an option, right? You could buy maybe a Studebaker, but those are no longer around. But you couldn't really buy a small Honda. They came in, the Japanese automakers came in the 60s first. And it was such a change in the market from what the American companies were building at that time. And just like the wages, the American companies around 73, after the oil embargo, the American companies finally responded and started making small cars. Now, those small cars were not very good that the American companies made. And they eventually lost market share. I mean, there was a time General Motors had a 50% market share in the U.S. Now, collectively, Detroit does not have a 50% market share. So it is transformative. They really have had an outsized impact on every piece of this industry, suppliers, for good and ill. If you remember the price fixing scandal from actually when I first started here in 2011, so 14 years ago for me, they've had a really outsized impact.
And Larry, I'd say to a degree that's still impacting things today, because even the threat of potential Chinese competition, Chinese automakers setting up shop, are getting the Detroit 3 to really take a look at themselves and change, honestly, how they manufacture cars. You looked at that Ford announcement from a few weeks ago. They're tearing up Henry Ford's assembly line. They're trying to be faster and more efficient to compete with the Chinese, because they don't want to happen what happened to them when the other importers first came to the US.
Yeah.
Right. There's
But
been
not,
so much that's influenced the industry, the importers coming in, and right now tariffs and the China competition, and all of it really, really emphasizes how global this industry is. It's not a US auto industry.
right. It used to be, we used to matter. Now, now we're not the largest auto market in the world. We're not even close to what China is. We are a distant number 2.
Well, real quick, I want to pivot. Mike, What does the future hold for legacy and new automakers over the next 50 years?
Well, if I really knew the answer, I may not be working in automotive news anymore, but I'll give it a crack. I'll take a look into the
Would you tell
crystal
me,
ball.
please?
Yeah, no, I'd love to.
I'm closer to retirement than you are.
I think you have to imagine over the next 50 years that there might be some consolidation. You know, especially over the past decade or so, we've seen the rise of a lot of electric vehicle startups. And I know we'll be talking more about EVs and their role in the industry later on, but you have to imagine maybe not everybody that's sprung up recently is going to be here 50 years from now. I would say too, it may be a safe bet that some of the established players look a lot different. You see the GMs and the Fords and the Toyotas of the world really leaning heavily more into software and leaning into subscription services and trying to diversify their portfolio and not have the entire business cycle riding on the ups and downs of a product life cycle plan for a particular truck or crossover. So the big guys are changing. I have to imagine maybe some folks won't be here that are here today, but they're pushing the envelope. Everybody's trying to figure out the answer. That's going to be fun to try to document that in the pages of automotive news.
Larry, I want you to answer that question as well, but we do have an audience question that goes right with it. Someone is asking, what changes do you expect more quickly in the next 5 years? So let's start there, and then we want to hear your 50-year outlook as well.
Yeah. In the next 5 years, I think you're going to see, we are right now in a wave, right? We are in the trough of a wave, and that has to do, it's because of the changes with tariffs and regulation. And automakers really don't know what they're going to do. Right now, they've been, there are other plans. They plan out 10 years in advance or further. And all their plans have been blown up because of the changes in the regulatory structure and how what products they were planning to make or in the future. So the next 5 years are going to be very interesting, unless you're a product planner, and then you're not going to have any hair. But further out, the one piece that Mike didn't mention that we're just starting to see the cusp of is really sea change in the level of robotics in manufacturing. The United Auto Workers have complained for a long time about losing jobs to Mexico and to low-cost manufacturing countries like China. The real threat, though, is robotics, because those jobs don't come back. Once you teach a robot to do something, it does it very well, and it does it over and over and over and over again ad infinitum, and always at the same level. And the development in robotics right now is spectacular, and it's eye-opening. And it's not just the giant Kamau robots, that lift a big piece and weld it together. Stuff that's been there for 50, 60 years. It's now these humanoid robots and the robots that are taking jobs by just delivering parts to the line. That all used to be humans, and now it's robots.
Right. And a lot of that robot development is happening in China, like Mike mentioned. It's another piece of the Chinese competition.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, exactly.
I want to switch to talk about some of the characters, the people in the industry. Who are some of the people who had the biggest impact on the auto industry in the years that you've covered automakers? Mike, let's start with you.
Yeah, I love this question because this industry is all about the people who are making the products, right? Throughout the century we've covered it, some really outsized personalities. And I'll tell you, for me, I've covered Ford for a little over a decade now, and I think Alan Mulally is one that really stands out. Although I'll admit, one of my first automotive events was one of his last, so we didn't necessarily overlap. But as CEO of Ford Motor Company, helping them avoid the bankruptcy, really getting their financials back on track, his impact has lasted well beyond his tenure. I still have dealers I talked to today in the year 2025 who talk about how important it was for Mullally within months of being hired to go to the dealers. They all gathered at Ford Field, the football stadium here in Detroit, and Mullally had Ford employees stand up and turn to the dealers and shout, "We love you." And that had such a lasting impact that, again, dealers still mention it to me today. They also talk about how Alan would go to the showrooms and actually sell cars. There's documented instances at Village Ford in Dearborn or Galpin Ford in California, or he went on the showroom floor. And I don't know how many he sold, but I think he helped turn a few. And that was sort of an important.
I've always wondered if he got a spiff check for that.
I think he was doing just fine, right? But he sort of exemplified that servant leadership style that folks really appreciated. But I will say, again, because I did not spend as much time with Alan, I'll say somebody who I have talked a lot with during my time is Bill Ford. And I would say his impact on the industry is also notable. He's the longest serving chairman of the board at Ford, the great grandson of Henry Ford, right? His career's sort of been defined by crises. Shortly after he became board chairman, you had the explosion at the Rouge, and he went down there on site to be with the grieving families and assess the situation. He's been through pandemics. He's been through the recession. He's the one who hired Mullally after he fired himself as CEO, essentially. And he's made a lot of the decisions that have steered Ford through the years. And what I've come to learn about Bill Ford is that no matter what's going on externally, he's sort of, for better or worse, the steadying force, right? He has set the long-term vision that the CEOs that he hires executes. But for investors, for dealers, for anybody associated with the company, they can always look to him really for that high-level guidance. And I think he's one of those personalities that 200 years from now, we'll look back and remember.
Yeah, and I'll just mention too that we gave out some centennial awards so people can read more about these people in the industry, and we have another project coming out next week about people who have disrupted the industry and really forced the industry to change in new ways. Larry, who's on your list?
Let me just jump in about Bill Ford, because one of the things I think is really interesting about this industry, right? This is a massive industry. I mean, there are now hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans that work in this industry. But the fact that individuals whose name happens to be on their vehicles can still have such a weighty impact it boggles my mind, right? This is not the Chase of the Citibank. These are individuals whose names are on the products that they build. Ford, Akio Toyota, although different spelling, right? Wolfgang Porsche. It's fascinating to me. But I want to talk about somebody that I covered. Easily the smartest man I have ever spoken to in my life. And I interviewed Edward Teller when I was younger. But Sergio Marchionne, easily the smartest guy I ever talked to. Interviewing him was like playing 4-level chess and losing. You knew that no matter what, he was going to win. I would try to come up with creative questions, but he just commanded an audience of reporters, and it was a spectacle every time that we got to interview him. But he holds a special place in my heart, I think, for a couple of reasons. I talked about the bankruptcy, right? I'm getting a little emotional about this. He saw value in Chrysler when no one else did. They shopped Chrysler before the bankruptcy. They shopped Chrysler to every automaker in the world and got turned down. And only one guy picked it up and said, yeah, we can use this. And that was Sergio, with Fiat of all companies, right? small little Italian automaker that said, yeah, we can do this. And you look at all those tens of thousands of employees across the world who benefited and are still working today. And all those Jeeps that are still running today because of that one guy and the vision that he had. He was an interesting character, and we had our challenges with Sergio, as did every regulator that he ever dealt with. But he was absolutely brilliant. And we talk about the Centennial book. I wrote a column about Sergio, about two covers. One was Michael can tell some funny stories about. We interviewed former publisher Jason Stein, and former managing editor Rick Johnson, and I interviewed Sergio for about 2.5 hours on August 15th, 2015. And it was absolutely the best interview any of us had ever done. And it blew up. Mike was at the Detroit News then with our former colleague, Mike Whalen. And Mike Whalen talked about being on a plane just about to take off when the news of all this Sergio news broke. And it was fantastic for me. Mike Whalen, not so much.
Or me with him on the plane. I had to sort of pick up some slack there. So thanks a lot, buddy.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem.
That's great. It's nice to hear kind of two sides of a person with Sergio. So brilliant, even though, we face challenges in covering the company. Sometimes it was a real big impact on the industry. Mike, I think you had one more person you wanted.
Challenges in covering the company that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one more, and this is cheating a little bit because Larry or I didn't cover him, but I don't think you can have a segment like this talking about impact on the industry without mentioning Lee Iacocca. Impact for two of the Detroit three, really one of the fathers of the Ford Mustang. And Larry mentioned the bankruptcies in the late 2000s. He helped Chrysler avoid a bankruptcy in 1980, in the early 80s, with his cost-cutting initiatives and the union accepting concessions at the time. Also the father of the minivan while at Chrysler, right? So he was also sort of big in pop culture and extending beyond the automotive industry. There was a Gallup poll, I think, in the mid 80s that said, who's somebody that you admire the most? And the top three responses were Pope John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, and Lee Iacocca, number three. The next year, he was number two behind only the Pope. So it shows you how some of these people that we've interacted with, again, extend well beyond the auto industry. He was a tremendous salesman, a tremendous business mind. And, while Larry or I didn't cover him, Hannah, somebody at Automotive News certainly did. And I think we have something fun about that.
Yeah, that is cool. Something to be proud of. And, speaking of Lee Iacocca, Keith Crain recently shared a story about Ford's firing of Iacocca in 1978. Mr. Crain is chairman of Crain Communications and became publisher and editor-in-chief of Automotive News when Crain purchased Automotive News in 1971. So in 1978, Iacocca, Ford's president at the time, was fired. And in a clip that we'll play, Mr. Crain shares how Automotive News broke that story. This was before the internet. He called the Iacocca household just as Lee Iacocca was coming home from work. Automotive News knew about his bad day before even his wife did. So Keith Crain got Iacocca on the phone, and he confirmed that he got fired. It was a Thursday night, so not ideal for our print deadlines even back then. So the Automotive News editors put the story on the newswire, and as Mr. Crain says, it went around the world and it put Automotive News on the map. So Jake, let's hear that clip.
We ran the story, and at first the people in Detroit got the story, and then the people in New York got the story, and then the people in Europe got the story, and then the people in Japan, and it kept going all the way around until everybody had covered the story. We then ran a second story that the world confirms the Automotive News story. So we got it twice.
Yeah.
And it was indeed a big deal.
Yeah.
Now, there were a lot of other big deals, I think, but none came close to that one.
And that's such a big moment for automotive news and one of so many pivotal industry moments that we've covered.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks to Mike and to Larry for bringing up Iacocca and talking automakers with us. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Gail.
So, some other huge industry shifts have been on the supplier side. John Irwin, our supplier reporter, joins us next. I think he's making his way to the studio now. We've covered, Cal, a lot of big supply chain stories lately.
Yes.
We had the pandemic, which was really, really disruptive for the whole industry, down to suppliers. We had inflation, strikes, tariffs. I mean, we've been covering tariffs from the supplier point of view so much this year, and it's such a big, big ecosystem that the trickle down is very real, and the impact is so varied.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone like myself that has, been working for automotive news now maybe 4 or 5 years, and just being a automotive just car gearhead and not really knowing the business side of what happens with suppliers, and just in this 4 or 5 years, all the things that I've learned from suppliers from the top all the way down, it's been an interesting 5 to 6 years for suppliers, to say the least. So and we've been on top of it the entire time. So John Irwin's here to join us. John, how are you, friend?
Doing well. How are you guys doing?
Doing all right. So, John, the past several years have been historic for the auto supplier chain, or excuse me, the auto supply chain, I should say, with several shocks caused by the pandemic, inflation, strikes, tariffs, just to name a few. How have suppliers adapted to these challenges?
Yeah, it's been, like you said, a really interesting few years for suppliers. I've talked with a few executives over the past year or two, really dating back to the pandemic. And a lot of them, it's easy to say, we've just talked about the 08, 09 bankruptcies and the massive impact, obviously, that those had on the auto industry. But for some suppliers, they're comparing the past couple of years with 08 and 09, just in terms of the impact that they're having on their businesses. Really it dates back to 2019. We could start with the UAW strike in 2019 for a lot of suppliers that really started to dig into a lot of their finances then. Just as they're starting to think about recovering a bit from that, we get into the pandemic and obviously the 2 month shutdowns that really put pretty much everyone on hold for a couple of months. And then all of the shocks that came after that, whether that was supply chain shortages, labor shortages, obviously the semiconductor shortage, which for a couple of years really put millions of vehicles on hold, which obviously put a lot of strain on suppliers. And then obviously through to the current day with tariffs and kind of the changing trade landscape. So there's a lot going on for suppliers during that time, especially coming out of the pandemic. There were a lot of companies that just, unlike automakers and dealers who are able, despite the lower sales, to kind of maintain their profit margins. That wasn't really the case for a lot of suppliers. In large part, that's because, well, they were getting squeezed a little bit on the margins, but also they're having to make a lot of investments in electrification and kind of banking on returns coming a couple years later. Obviously, lots of ups and downs with inflation or with electrification, and we're seeing a lot of suppliers not getting the returns maybe that they were thinking that they would get a couple years ago. And so just as they're starting to kind of adapt to that, now they're dealing with tariffs and changes in trade. So it's been a lot. I think it's fair to say the past 5 years have been some of the more historic 5-year stretches that we've seen for the supply base over the past 100 years.
Yeah, definitely a lot has happened just in recent history. John, how might the supply chain evolve in the coming years now?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, one thing that's kind of standing out, and this dates back even before the past 5 years, but I think it came on a lot of people's radar after the 2011 tsunami that devastated a lot of Japan, and there were a lot of aftershocks and that impacted the auto industry, and that's the importance of regionalization and localization. that's something that's come up repeatedly since then. Obviously, during NAFTA renegotiations, giving us USMCA, and then now, that's obviously front of mind with tariffs and companies trying to rethink how what their supply chains look like. I think a lot of companies are learning the importance of not relying on, one supplier or one region for a given product or anything like that. I think we're seeing that a lot recently with China and rare earth magnets. I think that's another area where companies are sort of realizing that, okay, there's this really important material. Maybe we didn't realize that supply was had the potential to be constrained like that. So I think that'll take years for changes like that to take place. But I think companies are doing a lot of what they can to really try to diversify their supply bases. And then software and technology. I mean, a lot of tech companies are coming into the auto space. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But chip makers as well. I mean, during the semiconductor shortage, it became very clear how important chip manufacturers were to the auto industry. That's only going to continue to become more important. And in a lot of cases, these companies don't necessarily fit in the traditional, automaker tier 1 supplier, tier 2 supply chain that we think of. A lot of them kind of, it might be more of a supply circle or something like that, where these companies sort of, work with the tier 1s, tier 2s, even the automakers, and their importance is only going to continue growing. And as software defined vehicles, those have long been promised. As those maybe hit the roadway soon, that's going to fundamentally transform a lot of the supply chain, I think. So yeah, it's in for we're in for an interesting several years for automotive suppliers and the supply chain overall. That's for sure.
Yeah, we'll be
John,
watching closely.
Excuse me, Hannah, didn't mean to interrupt you. But John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Richard Truett. Now, this is my fellow Hannah Automotive News gearhead. He's the guy I can talk about wrenching under the hood with. So I'm happy that he's here. He covers engineering. He's next. Just waiting for him to jump into the studio to join us. Which, fun fact, Richard has a lot of cars that he has worked on since I have now known him at Automotive News. And when I visit Detroit, I may need to stop by his house and see what he is currently working on, because he always has a project going. Richard, how are you, sir?
Doing great, Cal. Hi, Hannah.
Hi, Richard. How's it going?
Doing fine, thanks.
So, Richard, you wrote a story about engines as part of our Centennial coverage this year, but you didn't delve into the technical details of the engine. Instead, you focused more on the human element. What was your thinking in choosing that angle?
Well, when we think about cars, what makes them appeal to people? I think it's two things: notable styling and the way a car sounds and performs. I think those are the hooks that get people passionate about cars. And so we're going to deal with styling in a few weeks down the road. But my part of it was to talk about engines and how they sort of attract people to vehicles. And it's not just a dads and dudes kind of thing, because I talked to a lady down at the Corvette plant in Kentucky who builds engines, one of 12 ladies who builds engines for the Corvette. So we're seeing women also involved with engines, including at dealerships where female technicians are becoming more and more a regular sight.
And Richard, sorry, I lost my place here. I wanted to ask you how that love affair may be in danger at the dawn of the EV era. So much is changing on the powertrain side. Tell us more about that.
Yes, if you have driven for an EV or many EVs, they all tend to sound and feel the same. There's not a lot of visceral sensations that differ from one EV to the next. Whereas if you, back in the old days, or the old days being a few years ago, if you took a Mustang GT around the corner and a Camaro and a Nissan GTR, you would feel something different and exclusive to each of one of those models. Well, EVs don't have that. And as long as we're on the subject, let me play a little sound clip for you. I asked our friends at Stellantis if they could share with us how the electric Dodge Charger sounds. That's an electric car, and what's more, that's an admission that automakers know that if they want to keep the passion and the excitement around cars, something that sounds like a refrigerator is probably not going to get it done. So we're in the early days of EVs yet. They're going to evolve in some ways. I don't know if these artificial sounds are going to be viewed as something hokey or something necessary, but automakers recognize that a car has to have some kind of personality to have that same kind of appeal, at least a performance car.
Yeah,
Well,
I
Richard,
remember that being a big, controversy, might be going too far, but for racing, if
Yeah.
race cars become electric, it's just going to be a little buzz at the racetrack. People were pretty upset about that idea.
There
Yeah,
is a
we call
Formula E series, and
Yeah.
they don't make any noise as they go around the track. So you're right about that.
we call it having a soul. We call it
Having
the
a soul.
car having a soul and feeling the soul of the car when the engine rumbles. So, I mean, sounds coming from a speaker, I mean, it's cool, but we want to feel that rumble. You want to feel that soul of the engine.
We do, but let me just say that we're not talking about just performance cars and sports cars. An engine in a Toyota and a Honda can give that a different kind of assurance, because we know that traditionally it's made like a Swiss watch and people trust it, or a GM 3800 V6. These engines are like renowned for never breaking, and that's a different kind of appeal too. So it's not just sports car engines. I just want to make that clear that people love engines for all sorts of different reasons. Dependability, reliability, of course, would be another aspect of it.
And not directly related to the engine, but just the sound of the car and the sound of an EV, it can be a safety issue as well. So I know the industry has been
Yes.
trying to figure out how to make it clear that an electric vehicle is coming or backing out. And there's a variety of sounds out there to let people know.
As we celebrate our first 100 years and look to the next 100 years, how this evolves should give me for the next few years and whoever takes my place in the next century of coverage a lot to write about, because it's a fast moving kind of thing.
It is. Well, thank you, Richard.
Thank you for.
Let's add Hans Greimel to the conversation. We'll give him a minute to join. Oh, here he is. Hi, Hans.
Hi there. How are you? Thanks,
Good.
Anna.
Thanks
Hi,
for
Kel.
joining.
Hey, Hans.
Hans is our Asia editor. Hans, our first question for you. Well, first of all, what time is it? Thanks for joining us in the middle of the night.
Yeah,
Middle of the
thanks.
night.
Just as a positioning here. Yeah, I'm talking to you guys from Tokyo, Japan. It's 1:40 a.m. here on
Oof.
Thursday, August 28th already. So I'm near China, but not next door to China, but not actually in China, but in Japan.
There's lots to cover in Japan as well. Well, thanks for staying up with us, and hopefully you can get back to sleep after we ask you some questions here. So to start, how did China emerge really as this automotive superpower? What was kind of the journey there?
Well, it's really a remarkable transformation that wasn't even seen it by any other company or country going through this progress through the automotive industry. When we go back to the 1980s, private car ownership was virtually unheard of in China. When I first went to Shanghai in the early 90s, I was really struck by just how many bicycles there still were on the streets of Shanghai. But, 1985, it was when Volkswagen first set up local production there. And that really unleashed a flood of international investment from the big global players. And it wasn't long before, companies like General Motors or Volkswagen or brands like Audi and even the Japanese like Nissan were using China as kind of the next big cash cow. They were really piling into the country and riding its economic wave, basically. Now, they were initially kind of hobbled by a bunch of regulations there, including tariffs. They couldn't really export into China, so they had to set up shop locally. And then they were also kind of required to set up with local affiliates, which were usually they were kind of chained to big state-owned enterprises. So they weren't really given free rein to operate there as they would in their home countries or in the free markets. And all along the government, however, was kind of promoting their own internal policies of how they can establish a vibrant homegrown industry of their own. And that's where they started this idea of promoting a push into the electrified vehicles in a way, as a way to leapfrog into the future and surpass basically the global industry. And that's what you've seen really transform in the more recent years. Whereas the international brands at one point had, like, the lion's share of the local market. Let's say about 60% of the local market was owned by the international brands. As recently as, let's say, 2020. In 2024, it completely reversed, and now the Chinese local brands have taken like 65% of the local market. So it's a radical transformation, and we see China now on top of the global industry as the biggest producer, the biggest local market, and now the biggest exporter, exporting about 6 million cars globally. And 6 million cars is more than Japan's total domestic market. So it's now the world's biggest exporter as well.
Well, like you said, Hans, China was once a cash cow for international brands, but how are the overseas players faring there today?
Well, it's really a reversal of fortunes for the international players in Japan. It used to be a cash cow, and now they are really struggling. We've seen like brands like Acura and Suzuki and Fiat, Mitsubishi. They've all kind of quit the market because they just can't make a go of it there anymore. Other brands like General Motors and even Volkswagen are really struggling there. We've seen Nissan and Toyota as well collapse in the local market there. And it's really a testament to the competitiveness of the local brands, and the changing tastes of the Chinese consumers, that they are really rallying behind the local brands. And the local brands have basically products and technologies that appeal in ways that the international brands can't compete with yet.
Wow. And in what way do Chinese automakers lead the global industry today and pose a threat to traditional international brands?
Well, in so many ways, the rise of China kind of mirrors the rise of Japan in the 1970s and 80s. It has a lot of the international brands thinking about China as in the way that we used to think about Japan in the 1980s, that it's going to take over the world, that the Chinese brands are going to gobble up the international brands and make Detroit a hollowed out, basically. And they're doing that through a range of new technologies in manufacturing and in things like electrification, and especially software-defined vehicles. And these are all ways that these new brands that people might not even know the names of, things like Neo or Xpeng or Zeekr. These are brands that might sound completely foreign to the average American consumer, but they are big names in China, and they're increasingly big names on the global stage because they are pairing up with technology companies in China in the ways that are unique and not yet fully developed in the outside world.
Yeah, really interesting. We have a question from the audience. Hans, what do you think about competition? I mean, do you believe that the American auto industry could withstand the Chinese one, could compete with it? And how can others really compete with China's advancements?
Well, that's a good question. I think let's take a look at how to compete in China. I think that there's two kinds of schools of thought about how we can maybe compete, or that international brands can compete in China. And one is, well, there is no way to compete in China because China's on a path towards a future that's kind of like Japan or Korea, where the local brands dominate the local market and the international brands will be relegated to a sliver of a unique kind of niche market, like 10% or less of the local market. So what's the point of even performing or trying to compete in China? And I think what we see are is a flip side to that, where The brands that are there and struggling to compete know it's an uphill battle, but they have to compete in the China market. They have to be immersed in the local ways of manufacturing and software and AI and connectivity, because if they're not competing in the Chinese market against the Chinese, then their products aren't going to be good enough to compete on the global stage when the Chinese go international. So they want to be ready to compete globally by competing against the Chinese face to face in the home market. And I think that's the first step that they have to come to grips with. The other thing is that it's probably a combination of protection and reinvention, so that the international brands need some protection through tariffs and other policies of support while they reinvent themselves along the lines of the Chinese model. So I think you're seeing maybe a little bit of a balance on both protection and reinvention.
Yeah, and things are moving really fast. That is for sure. So it's dangerous for companies to just sit back and watch. Everybody's moving quickly. Thank you so much, Hans.
You're welcome.
All right, now let's welcome Laurence Iliff, who covers Tesla and other EV makers, along with broader EV topics like sales and charging infrastructure. Thanks for joining, Lonnie.
It's great to be here.
All right, Lonnie. So EVs have been around in some way for most of this century. Why is it taking so long for EVs to become mainstream? And are we facing similar challenges to the ones we faced so many years ago?
Yeah, I think this is a critical question. And as I talk to, analysts and CEOs at startups, the question keeps coming up like, why are we only at 8% EV adoption, right? It's a lot of cars, right? But it's not what we expected. People have spent insane amounts of money. It's on the pages of Automotive news every single day about this investment and that investment and this factory. And if you think about EV adoption right now, if you look at the other side of it, is 92% of new car buyers are buying combustion engines in mid 2025, right? 5 years ago, we certainly thought we were going to be, 15% or 20% on our way to, 40 or 50% at 2030. And it hasn't happened. And, Hannah and I, we did some stories. We looked back, at the history of electric vehicles and hybrids, right? There were some hybrids back in the day. And what was interesting was, there are some important parallels there that we need to focus on that are useful. And obviously, EVs were expensive back then. They were kind of rich luxury products. Right now, if you look at the market, it's dominated mostly by luxury EVs because automakers want to make money so they can make cheaper EVs, kind of that reverse pyramid. And then charging and fueling, right? If you look back, EVs back in the day, more than a century ago, it was difficult to charge them. It was slow. They didn't have very much range. And when the combustion car, especially the Model T came, it was really freedom for people. It was much cheaper, especially over time, right? You had more range and then you could fuel up and you had a lot more miles. And so I think one thing that, maybe the industry or people who think about EVs, failed to consider was the power of the combustion engine, the power of that freedom, the power of that infrastructure, right? And the idea that people, EVs are great. And I want to disagree with Richard Truett here for a second about, the sound of the engine and the vibration, right? Yeah, in a $25,000 or $30,000 car with tons of emission controls and a CVT transmission and a small 4-cylinder engine and a turbo, I'll take an EV any day. They're smooth, they're quiet. So there are sounds you want to hear and there are sounds you don't want to hear, right?
That is
And
true.
so I will just make that argument. But I think also, the the automakers like Toyota, they've also responded to the challenge of EVs by making better combustion cars, by making hybrids, by making, I mean, plug-in hybrids aren't a big thing in the United States right now, but they are in other markets. You know, and so I think it, you know, as we look to the EV future, I think if we're going to accelerate that, obviously we need cheaper EVs because they're too expensive. We need more charging. And the good news is that the public charging infrastructure is growing. And then I think we need to really recognize that combustion engine, that freedom, you know, we have to educate people about how they can fuel their vehicle and feel safe and comfortable and enjoy that freedom in a vehicle with lower emissions.
Well, Lonnie, you know, we can't have this conversation without talking about Tesla.
Yes.
So, yes. So Tesla disrupted the auto industry, but is now focused more on robo-taxis and robots. I did not have that on my bingo card 7, 8 years ago. They're focused on that than rather launching new models and growing sales. Why is that?
You know, it's really fascinating because just a few years ago when I was covering, you know, like the earnings calls and, you know, Elon Musk, who, I mean, he, when we're talking about, you know, big figures in the industry, I mean, he really came from the Silicon Valley perspective and said, okay, there's this thing over here and I'm going to disrupt it. I'm going to mess it up. I'm going to go in and, you know, that's when they decided to use, you know, lithium ion battery technology, the batteries that are in laptops, and said, what if we put just like lots of those things together? And we fixed one of the problems at the time, which is range, right? And so he came in and almost, I mean, it was almost miraculous, like taking like extremely risky decisions. No, I'm not going to do what everybody else is telling me I'm going to do this, just over and over and over again, really making, you know, tough decisions, making big mistakes, having to fix them and go back. But you have to make those big mistakes. And so he created this thing and he said, okay, we're going to go from, I think there were about 2 million at that point. We're going to go from 2 million. And then we're going to do, you know, 3.5, and then we're going to do 7 million cars a year in sales. Sorry. And then we're going to do, you know, 10, and then who knows, we'll maybe get to 20 million cars a year. I mean, you know, that's like, what? That's crazy. It's just such a big number. And then he was going to make, you know, a $25,000 car. And then just a couple of years ago, he just changed his mind and he said, you know, rather than build a bunch of new models, I'm going to do this autonomy thing. This is the new thing. I'm going to disrupt myself, basically, but really disrupt the industry. And, you know, it makes sense because, you know, margins are coming down for Tesla. Sales are coming down for Tesla. In a way, he needs to find the next big thing. You know, he's not going to sell 20 million cars a year when sales are going down, right? For Tesla, there's competition. People are coming to the market, China. And so I think it's really interesting that he said, rather than people having car ownership, they're going to be driving around in robo-taxis. They're going to, for, you know, I think 30 cents a mile is what he said at the last thing. So, you know, if you add it up, you go to the grocery store, you go here, and you don't have to have a car, and you don't have to have it sitting in your driveway, and you don't have to worry about it. And so I think it's a big bet. And then the thing with the robots, I mean, the idea is that we're all going to have a personal robot, and there's going to be billions of them, and they're going to work in the factories, and we're all going to be rich and sit around. We won't have to work because of all the wealth that's being created. So I find it fascinating that there's that pivot by, you know, a guy who's really done some amazing things.
Yeah, he really elevated the electric vehicle sector. Maybe he'll do the same with robotics. We'll have to see. We do have an audience question for you, Lonnie, and I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you really believe that EVs are the future?
They have to be. I mean, it really is. I think objectively, if you really look at it, it's a better technology. You know, I have a relative, I'll just give it a little example. I have a relative who has solar panels that directly charge their EV, right? And so it goes directly from the sun to the solar panel into their EV, and then they drive it around. And so the beauty of electric vehicles is not only are they much, much more efficient in terms of the energy they use, but also that you can bring in energy from electricity from different sources, right? From wind. I know it's not, the policy of the government right now, wind and solar and stuff, but there are days in California where we run completely on renewable energy, the whole state,
Wow.
the fourth biggest economy in the world. And so I think combustion vehicles are fantastic. I said, they gave us freedom, 100 years ago, and it's been an amazing 100-year journey, but I really do think they are the future.
Wow.
Okay.
Interesting stuff. Good stuff. Lonnie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Well, next joining us is Gail Howe, who covers who covers the dealership and buy sell space. Gail, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks, Cal.
So, Gail, what trends have you seen in dealership consolidation, and what do you anticipate for the future of dealership consolidation?
So if you go back to the beginning, way back to the 1930s, the NADA data shows us, there are about 40,000 car dealerships in the U.S. And most of those were, owned by one dealer who owned the one store. But then by the 1980s, that number shrunk by more than half. Now we're at 20,000, dealership owners in the U.S. And then by the 2010s, we're at 8,000. And that the change was, brought on by these big, publicly held dealership groups entering, the arena. They're owning hundreds of stores. And then there, are also a bunch of regional privately held dealership groups, that are continuing to grow. We did speak with Erin Kerrigan, who is, a broker in this space. And she thinks that the number of owners right now is still around 8,000. But she's predicting that will drop, to about 6,000 in the next 20 or 25 years, with these large consolidators, like the ones on our Automotive News Top 150, list, that those will make up, most of those dealership owners. Retail experts that we talk to, they're really hesitant to make predictions on specific numbers, but they agree, this consolidation is going to continue, and that the number of dealers, who own 5 or fewer stores than that number is going to keep shrinking, and that there is, staying power in those dealerships in more rural locations. We spoke to one analyst that said that he predicts that, this is David Whiston, he's a Morningstar analyst, and he predicted that the number of dealers who own 5 or less dealerships, that number is going to fall, less than 90%. And in the next 10 to 15 years, it's going to fall again, to like the low 80 or, 70%. So again, more, consolidation, and, having top publicly held groups, generating more buy sell deals, that they'll be the ones, at the forefront. Whereas historically, those deals were, generated more so by the owners who had 1 or 2 stores. Consolidation is going to continue at a quick pace in these metro markets. People are telling us, but maybe, not so much in the rural areas. And, those trends, as automakers are looking to reduce their dealer count, might not affect the rural dealer so much. And one thing that was interesting is that Alan Haig, he's president of advisory firm Haig Partners. He had said, consolidation, especially for the groups, with 20 stores or more, that's going to continue. But he noted that not all consolidation, is great. He brought up the idea that, dating way back, local dealers are the ones who help their communities. They help
Right.
local charities. Not to say that the large consolidators are not doing that, but there's a space for the local dealer to stay on as well, and support the little league team, or the PTO functions and things like that.
Yeah, being a true part of the community is very valuable. Um,
Absolutely.
Gail, you also contributed to a project about some of the most legendary auto dealers. What were you hearing from some of those longtime dealers in the industry, and what advice did they share for the up and coming?
Yeah, so that was a really great project as part of our, AN 100 coverage. We spoke with 8 dealers, and they ranged in age from their late 60s, through their 90s. And what we found is, these dealers are active in their stores. Many are coming in daily, and they still have the same, competitive spirit that they did when they started. And some of them started as children, as teens, working with parents, or taking a part-time job to get into the industry, and they're looking to continue these new challenges, and no immediate plans to retire. I mean, they've worked through the early days of racism, sexism, world wars. They know how to adapt and survive. And now they're using those skills to help sell EVs and to deal with import tariffs. But when it comes down to it, the one thing that they all agreed on, and this was touched upon earlier in our broadcast, is it's a people business. So when it comes down to it, all of the changes that they have gone through, it really just goes down to how you deal with people and creating the right relationships with them. And I can kind of go through, and highlight some of, the big things that were mentioned. Like, there's a Pennsylvania dealer, Blaze Alexander. He said, if you get good people, keep them, pay them, do whatever it takes, to keep them and maybe develop them as a manager. He also said to younger employees, he said, just listen, put the time in, and, eventually you will become successful. We spoke to John Bergstrom, who is on our top 150 list, and he is a champion of treating customers as if they're family. He refers to them as his guests. And he talks again about the long-term relationships, you're building with customers, taking care of them, not necessarily focusing on making the money. Eventually it will come with those relationships. Randy Berline talks about having a strong service department, and how that strength in service is going to keep customers coming back. And he tells, blossoming dealers, younger dealers, to be honest, take care of their customers. It's kind of a theme, right? Take care of your employees. We spoke with Norman Brayman, and, he talks about hands-on management, having a devotion to learning your product. He stressed how important that is, and treating customers how you want to be treated. How they want to be treated is usually how you want to be treated. As far as younger people who are in the industry, Geronimo Esteve talks about keeping your team happy, keeping them looking at the future so that they know how to, evolve, and that will keep them successful. It'll keep them, wanting to keep doing better. Michelle Prim, I could go on. There's so many lessons, but she was talking about younger people being patient in their careers. Not to expect anything is going to be given immediately, and having to earn it. Which is kind of like the tenet that she used in her own career. Ellen Spitzer talks about finding jobs where you're passionate, and that translates into employee satisfaction and employee longevity, which he said he values at his company. If a young person finds a job at a dealership and really enjoys the environment and stays there, that's something that, is a win-win for him as an owner, and also, for that person. And finally, we spoke with Kitty Van Bordel, and she was talking about, again, focusing on the customer, honest advice when they bring cars in for service, kind of echoing that service, motif. And then she also, I thought this was really interesting, was training employees about telling them that customers don't have to come there to buy their car, and so she really tells her, people when she's interviewing them, you have to be nice and you have to have a kind heart to work for her, because that will translate into what customers, form as their opinion of the store.
It definitely will. Those are great tips that the retail world should carry with them for the next 100 years. So thanks for sharing those, Gail.
Sure.
All right, next we have Mark Holmer. We'll continue talking about dealerships. Mark covers dealerships and retail technology. Hi, Mark.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
And we'll also have Jack Walsworth, a former retail reporter who now covers Volkswagen. Hi, Jack.
Everybody.
All right, Mark, starting with you, what were some of the first dealers like? What was their professional background that really led them to selling cars?
It was really more about them being entrepreneurs however, bicycle shop owners were the entrepreneur that was often the early dealership because they had the infrastructure, they understood the mechanics of getting something to move, a device to move. They knew how to make repairs, and they knew that automobiles had potential.
And cars, we know, quickly became essential, but tough economic times over the years have made them difficult for many people to purchase. What are some of the unusual approaches early dealership owners took when selling cars during those darker periods?
This blew my mind. Talking to uh, Jack or Jack Olson's grandson, Spencer Young, and he's chairman of the Young Automotive Group, and he launched his dealership during the Depression. And he sometimes took chickens, sheep, or pigs as down payments for new vehicles because times were tough, money was tight, and he needed to keep his business running. And his grandson followed that pursuit, that same pursuit in the 70s, similar type conditions. And a guy was interested in buying a car, and he didn't have enough for a down payment, but he said, I'm breeding bulldogs, and they're worth about $500, and would you take one as a down payment? And and it became the family dog, and he named it Brutus.
Can you imagine that today, trading livestock or a pet dog to get a car?
Times are certainly different, but I wonder in certain areas if dealers are more flexible than than in bigger markets, for example.
Yeah, maybe. Jack, what are some of the biggest innovations that came from those early dealership business interactions?
Sure. Yeah, there's kind of a few I wanted to highlight here, and Mark and I did a story around NADA show this year, looking back at the past 100 years. So we had a timeline, so I'll bring up some. One that really stuck out to me was in 1919, GM launched the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, which was basically the first financing arm designed to facilitate financing for vehicle purchases. I guess you could kind of call it the beginning of the F&I office, and obviously F&I is a critical huge part of today's auto retail environment. That's a huge profit driver. That's a big focus point for the publicly traded groups every quarter. What the F&I office does. So that one sticks out. Kind of somewhat related, in 1927, Reynolds and Reynolds put out its first standardized accounting forms for franchise dealerships. Again, very early days. Look a lot different than what it looks like today, and the Reynolds and Reynolds name goes back to the 1800s, and obviously still a very big player. So a couple of ones that go, from the early days we still are interacting with, on a daily basis here in 2025. Another one in the 50s, dealerships kind of started beginning lobbying state legislators for more protections with business interactions with manufacturers. NADA launched in 1917. So again, these things that were very critical from the beginning that we still are seeing here in 2025. And I bring up the lobbying and NADA because that's a very relevant topic in today's auto retail environment. Obviously, Tesla kind of changed how we deal with retail from they sell direct to consumer. That hasn't really happened before in this country. Lucid, Rivian have kind of followed suit. A couple other automakers want to go down that route, which is obviously a very big point or a big focus area right now. And funny enough, if we go all the way back to the Model T, that car came out in 1908. It's probably one of the most iconic names in the history of the automobile. Ford did try to go direct to consumer for a few years. It did not really work. And by 1912, I think 1913, Ford went back to the franchise system. So, here in 2025, the connection to that is Volkswagen Group has a new brand called Scout Motors, and Scout is independent, but they are tied to the group and they want to sell direct to consumer, which has obviously ruffled some feathers. So, I think Ford tried that back in the early 1900s. I guess it would have been an innovation at the time. It didn't really work. And now we're seeing it's kind of come back over 100 years later. And like I mentioned earlier, NADA, state legislation, things like that, those things happened decades ago. Those protections are now kind of popping up and are probably going to give Scout a difficult time, getting to direct to consumer. So it's very interesting looking back 100 years ago, what the model looks like, and today, it's obviously a lot more polished, a lot more evolved, but there's still some similarities. Kind of bringing it closer, I would say digital retail has become a bigger emphasis, and that was definitely an innovation that has been around, for a while. But I would say COVID, the pandemic, definitely sped that up. 2020 to now, digital retailing is just taken off, and I'm sure Mark can touch on that. But in the last 5 years, that environment has changed so much, and that's definitely a innovation in real time, I would say.
That's an interesting fun fact, Jack, that they tried to sell the Model T direct to consumer. I'm thinking like 1908, were they like trying to sell them door to door like Kirby vacuums? Like, so interesting.
Yeah, no, it's amazing, like the similarities when you look back on an industry like the auto industry.
Yeah. Jack, Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime.
All right, well, let's welcome Molly Boygon and Pete Bigelow. Molly covers technology and innovation, including software-defined vehicles, and Pete covers autonomous vehicles. Hello, Molly. Hello, Pete.
Hello, Hannah and Kel. How's it going?
Hello.
Great. How are you?
Doing well, thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody.
That delay keeps getting me. How you doing, Pete? All right. So many of the topics and companies you both cover look toward the future and the next 100 years. Molly, I want to start off with you. Let's talk software-defined vehicles first. What can SDVs do now, and what will they be able to do here in the future?
Yes, so software-defined vehicle is a very polarizing term, but the definition that I feel is most appropriate is a vehicle that can receive new functionality and new capabilities via over-the-air updates, and that can have a diverse network of developers that can add those new capabilities from even beyond an individual developer ecosystem at an automaker or at a tech company. And in order for that to be possible, vehicles have to have a sort of flexible architecture that allows the vehicle to receive that new capability and new functionality via software. Today, there are vehicles that can receive over-the-air updates, like Tesla, for example, is probably the most famous example. But the experts tell me that these vehicles still lack that open developer ecosystem, and also even different generations of the most sort of advanced software enabled vehicles, like Rivian vehicles, for example, have differences between generations that prevent software updates from going out across an entire brand lineup or multiple vehicles. There are still those hardware limitations that prevent sort of uniform updates from being pushed out over different vehicles.
And how will SDVs impact the larger vehicle landscape, Molly?
The industry is looking at a lot of disruption enabled by software-defined vehicles. So right now, a lot of people on this live will know that the average age of a vehicle in the US fleet is around 12 or 13 years. The vision is that software-defined vehicles will be able to even extend that lifespan. You'll be able to have a vehicle and update it with the latest technology, the latest features. You'll be able to activate subscriptions if you are going on a road trip to somewhere cold and you want, heated seats or a particular vehicle personalization or cabin lighting or something like that. And so it's designed to, or it's expected to extend the vehicle lifespan and just create a lot more kind of surprise and delight for the consumer. It's hard to even imagine what the capabilities may be that are enabled by software. Think about the cell phone. Think about how much can happen over a single operating system update, or how you can leverage your phone's camera or touchscreen for vastly different purposes using different applications. So that's what's planned for the future of software-defined vehicles.
And Pete, bringing you into this conversation, self-driving technology has been on a roller coaster for the better part of a decade. How could this play out over the long term?
Sure. I think that self-driving technology has definitely been on a roller coaster. That's kind of the right phrase. It was super hypey after the DARPA challenges, kind of right through 2016, and then kind of inverse to electric vehicles as the shine wore off automation for a while. Electric rose, and now we're kind of in the inverse where policy has obviously kind of provided a headwind for electric vehicles, but automation is once again red hot, and I think there are these kind of swings or micro swings from year to year. But over the long term, I do think that automated driving is going to, it's creeping into the vehicle fleet that car owners go out and buy today. It is on the road already in the form of robo taxis. 1,500 already deployed by Waymo, and others are shortly behind. It's coming into the freight world as well, probably a few years behind, but some real commercial traction there as well. So I do see over the long term, as we look ahead, that by 2040, 2050, this is going to be a part of the everyday.
So tell me more about the sequence. I mean, will these advancements happen equally and all at once, or will certain market segments succeed either before others or while others don't succeed at all?
Sure. I think you'll always have some winners and losers in various segments, but kind of to the point of it's already creeping in. We have more advanced functionality in driver assist systems today. You have automakers like General Motors, kind of promising more in the personally owned vehicle realm in the not too distant future. But I do see it happening in these niches, off-road, mining, farming. Look at some of the stuff that Oshkosh rolled out at CES this past year that's already on the road, airport baggage trucks. There's all these small things that are a little bit less complex than going onto a public road where there's pedestrians and bicyclists and that environment. And I think you'll see it mature in those niche markets, if we want to call it that, even though they're multi-million, multi-$100 million markets unto themselves. But we'll see it kind of mature there, and kind of seep into the on public road aspects of transportation.
All right, very interesting. We have a question from the audience that I'll ask both of you, and I'll remind the audience we're coming to a close here in a couple minutes, but if you have a question you'd like to ask now, or if there's more questions in the comments, we will go through the comments and answer those. So feel free to keep them coming, and we'll answer. So for Molly, I'm going to ask both of you. Molly, we'll start with you. What are a couple, one or two upcoming game changers that you see for vehicle technology looking toward the next 100 years, or maybe just the next 5?
I alluded to this earlier. There is so much chatter about the potential and potential pitfalls for vehicle subscriptions. So, the automotive industry is looking around at Netflix and HelloFresh and, Birchbox and fill in the blank. And this model has worked really well for other consumer products. And there's a lot of potential revenue opportunities, but the industry has to contend with accusations of price gouging and the fact that the consumer has awareness that in order to enable something like a subscription for a heated seat, the vehicle has to be equipped already with that hardware. So they know that they're paying for that and that it's not enabled in the vehicle. I think that the area that may pose the most promise for this, and I'll be curious to hear what Pete has to say, is safety and advanced driver assist functions, because that's already been a fairly successful upgrade for different manufacturers. Consumers do appear to be willing to pay for more advanced versions of existing safety features on the vehicle. One other thing I'll say on that is that it'll be interesting to see, for example, in 2029, automatic emergency braking is going to be required on all vehicles in the United States, all new vehicles in the United States. It'll be interesting to see how the subscription model plan is going to be affected by what appears to be a track that the nation is on to require some of these features as standard.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Pete, what do you see as the game changers?
Yeah, I mean, picking up the baton on safety, that's kind of been this problem for 100 years, right? Like in the 1930s, you had this alarming, number of pedestrians that were being killed, and it really sparked a backlash against the automobile. The automobile nonetheless grew, but today we still have, about 40,000 people killed every year in the United States 1.2, 1.3 million across the world every year. So, a question to watch is, does all this technology bring that number down substantially at some point? That's its great promise. But we've not seen it yet. We've kind of seen the numbers inch upward, inch downward by a percentage point or two. But there's still a heinous number of people who die every year in traffic accidents. So, that's one thing to watch as we look ahead for 25 years. The other, I think, would be, do people fundamentally still want to own vehicles? And I think, the death of car ownership has kind of prematurely been proclaimed already. There was the infamous blog post from the Lyft CEO back in 2016, 2017, where he said car ownership is going to be dead in all cities by 2025. That clearly hasn't happened here in 2025. But I do see, and as the nation gets more urban and as the world does as well, and we kind of live in these mega cities, do more people opt for a subscription to a ride hailing service? Whether that's a Waymo or whether that's, Amazon putting Zoox on its Prime network. You could start to see, like, not everybody. I don't think there's a one size fits all solution here for every consumer, but do a substantial number or substantial enough number of consumers peel off toward a subscription rather than saying that they want to own this piece of machinery that sits idle for 96% of the time.
So Pete, you're saying that I'm not going to get my flying car anytime soon.
I mean, that's weird. You could. There are flying cars technically for sale, but are they part of the mainstream? Do they make an impact on transportation writ large?
Pete. Break my heart, Pete. It's fine. Just break my heart. It's fine.
Yeah, I don't think that's happening anytime soon. But again, like, if you are, well-heeled, if that's the right way to think about this, if you're an executive and you want to go from Los Angeles to Pasadena or LAX to Santa Monica, we're starting to see the eVTOL companies draw closer to their scheduled commercial start dates in 2027, 2028 timeframe. Maybe it's the same thing. Maybe you don't want to go own your own personal flying car. Maybe you just want a subscription to a service that makes it easy for you, in theory, at least.
We got one more question from the audience before we wrap up, for Molly about SDVs. What is being done by the automakers and the government to make sure that the over-the-air updates and the software is safe and private?
This is a great question. So the auto industry, actually, part of the reason why software-defined vehicles have kind of been slower to roll out than expected is because of the safety, cybersecurity, data privacy standards that these different companies have to meet. So there is a fairly clear and robust set of standards governing those open source software updates and the underlying vehicle platforms, hardware and software. However, there is an interesting conversation happening right now around cybersecurity as it relates to components and software from foreign adversaries. So in particular, the spotlight has been on China. The Commerce Department has enacted what's functionally a ban on Chinese vehicle hardware and software. And the reason for that is because there are concerns about the ability of foreign adversaries to sort of harness vehicle technology for ill will. So that does kind of introduce some interesting questions about the efficacy of these standards. Are the standards enough on their own? Clearly, the government feels also that it has a role to play in terms of preventing bad actors from taking advantage of the existing system.
Good stuff. Molly, Pete, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Hannah, we have covered so much in 100 years, and there's so much to be excited about in the upcoming future. Thank you so much to our entire automotive news team.
Yes, I will echo that. And we'll continue that coverage in a big way at our Congress event, September 11th. It will be at the new Hudson's Building in downtown Detroit. And keynote speakers include automotive icons like General Motors' Mary Barra and Hyundai's Yusin Chung. Visit autonews.com/events to register for that. We hope to see you there. Until then, thanks so much for joining the Centennial Show. We feel so lucky to play a part in bringing you the automotive stories that you've relied on for the past century. Thank you to our colleagues again for joining us today and for sharing their stories and their expertise. For Kellen Walker and the rest of the Automotive News team, I'm Hannah Lutz. We'll see you next time.